On today's podcast, we're going to talk about culture and taking a systems approach to it, developing engagement and buy-in in your players and player development plans, discipline, and creating competition. And joining me to talk about that is JP Nerbun. JP is a coach, sports consultant, and the founder of TOC Culture Consulting, a global sports consulting business. He has over a decade of basketball experience coaching men and women in Ireland, Lithuania, and the United States at the professional, collegiate, and high school levels. And his mission is to help leaders and their teams grow through mentorship, coaching, and community. He does work with plenty of football teams and certainly understands the sport and what he can do to help coaches. So, JP, it's great to have you here on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Keith, I'm excited to connect with some football coaches. This is awesome.
First of all, so our coaches are aware, you did put together a great resource. You wrote a book called The Culture System. Tell us a little bit about that book before we dig into some of the things here.
Yeah, it's actually my second book. It really compiles kind of the best things that we've been able to help coaches implement within their teams to build culture. However, it's not just a bunch of really good ideas or ways to build culture. It's laid out in a systematic approach. And the power of a systems approach is that it takes a variety of tools, methods, ways of doing things, and it helps to make that more streamlined or easier to implement. And so that's the great challenge, right? So when I'm working with coaches and I'm coaching coaches this last 5-6 years, we have different ideas around how to discipline, how to set standards, how to invest in individuals, how to run your leadership. Well, how can we do this in a way that the average high school coach that's got 3-4 kids at their own, that they're going to take care of themselves at home, is teaching classes and then running a whole program and managing staff? Like how can we help coaches get culture right with such limited time? And that's the power of a systems approach, is it gets upstream and it's not just one thing. It's not just one silver bullet to get the culture right. It's able to implement a variety of strategies to build the culture. And so that's what this book is. I mean, we share great stories of a few American football teams in there, the Buffalo Bills, New England Patriots are featured in there, guys like Tony Dungy. But there's also the average high school or college coach out there that's also, we're talking about how these tools have been implemented within their programs.
I think the systems approach is good with anything that you're doing. Implementing a system means that you are going to have answers when something fails, right? When it fails, there's an answer, there's a solution. And this time of the year, we go out to all these clinics and AFCA and conventions and stuff like that, and we bring back great ideas. We get a glimpse at how somebody is doing things in their program, but that still doesn't give us a system. It might give us some ideas on how we can improve what we're doing, but you advocate for a systems approach, which is much different. So talk to us about that systems approach, how it works for a coach coming into a program or somebody who says, we got to do things better. We're going to take this approach to it.
Yeah, well, at the core of the system, what drives the system, and I talk about this in the book, is the leader. And this is, my journey started, I was coaching for years and I was fairly effective as a leader. But around 2012, I made a transition to high school down in basketball in Tennessee, and I was coaching there, and I was ineffective. And some of that is, that's around when Gen Z or, you're starting to coach that age group. So there were some external things that were challenges that made me ineffective as a leader, but really honestly, just my lack of own leadership, my own skill as a leader caught up with me. So we struggled with culture for a few years. And so the core of it is, and just like the core for me to make that change, it started with me. Like I was looking for character curriculums, leadership curriculums. I was looking for all the tools to fix my players. But it took me a while before I realized, well, first off, JP, you got to start working on yourself. Mm-hmm. And so at the core of the culture system is the leader and having a clear philosophy and clearly taking care of yourself and invest in yourself and not that you have to be perfect, but just continuously working on yourself. So that's at the core of it. Outside of that, the system is then this process where you establish the culture, you support the culture, and you enforce the culture. Okay. Now, first off, what do we mean by culture? Culture is measured in two ways. First off, how strongly are we connected here? How much do people feel like they belong? How much do they care for each other? What's the level of trust? And I always put that in my x-axis. Now, on my y-axis, I put the standards. How do we do things here? Not how we say we want to do things, but actually the behaviors day in and day out. And that's kind of how we measure it. Now, what drives that? Well, that's the leadership. And we really try to implement a decentralized command where it's not just the head coach that's driving it, but it comes down to the assistant coaches and then through the leadership council or the captain's council. And we have a very, 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 very intentional and specific way of doing that. We may not have great leaders, but it's going to be a way to develop leaders through this experience of giving them ownership over the program. So that's how we define culture. And when it comes to establishing, so it's about how do we establish relationships? How do we establish connections? How do we establish standards here? Coach standards, and how do we get the players to be part of that? And then we looked at support. How do we support those relationships? How do we continuously invest in our people and the team members throughout the year, as well as how do we support those standards when we start to see slippage? Because nobody's going to be perfect, right? There's going to be mistakes. So how can we come in there and coach individuals and help to develop, their character, their work ethic, their attitude, their mistake response, their mental toughness, so they're better able to meet those standards. But the last piece is you got to be able to enforce it. And the first starts with reinforcing what's working through the cultural language, through proper recognition, effective recognition, but also you got to discipline the right way. There has to be accountability. And that's a huge piece of it. We can talk a little about that later, but it's just making sure we're doing it in a way that is aligned with our philosophy as a leader and the long-term objectives of what we hope to achieve within these athletes' lives, which as far as just, intrinsically motivated, high character individuals is what we want leaving our program that can go on to be the successful later in life. And that's so it's disciplining in the right way. So that's kind of a brief overview of the system.
So when you're looking at that, you talked about the importance of the relationship. So when you're looking at the system, and I know people need to dig into the book to really get some of this, but if you could provide a great tip for this time of the year, new off season starting, maybe some new guys coming into your program, maybe you have a new program, but establishing or strengthening the relationships and bonds with those players.
I mean, that's where everything starts, right? So there's a great story that I share in the book. It's from this Captain Mike Abrashoff. He was the captain of the USS Benfold around 2000.
Yeah, he's been on the show before. Yeah, great
fantastic.
book. Yeah.
Yeah, and he started the turnaround with what? He started by sitting down and not just asking questions. And that's a rule. If our rule for leaders is listen first, speak last. But he's asking questions about their experience, what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy, and what they would do differently. But he also shared about himself. He would take people into his office in his cabin there, all 300 and something sailors, in the first 6 weeks. And he would talk about his experiences, talk about his family. That was his way of being vulnerable. Like people are like, vulnerability, like it's not just about like sharing weaknesses, it's just about showing yourself. And this is who I am. And so it's a great story of a leader that started with relationships, started to see his players, his sailors as people. And I think so often is who's the person behind the player, and when it comes to who's the individual, what challenges do they go home to? It's really truly understanding that and making sure that they know that you care about them as individuals. And so those early on one-on-ones are hugely important. And one of the ways that we really get intentional in those one-on-ones, and we can actually train our skills of listening and not just telling kids, not just giving them good lectures or telling them we care about them and telling them we love them, is to practice the skills of active listening, empathic listening. And we do that through intentional one-on-ones that coaches that I work with track throughout the year. So we might have that initial onboarding one-on-one where we get to learn about them. We get to learn about their goals, what's important to them, where do they want to go, what are their obstacles. But then we start to the next one-on-one, we might sit down with players, or an assistant coach might sit down with that player. And after we start to hopefully even document this, a lot of our coaches document what's called the player development plans, but we start to document not just those goals, but okay, so this is where you want to go. This is where you see yourself. This is where we see you, right? And this is let's talk about what we need to do to close that gap. And so once I understand what's important to an individual, what obstacles they face, where they see themselves, then I can start to coach them about how to close the gap from where they are to where they want to be. And we can do that, and we can untap this powerful intrinsic motivation, which for so many coaches seems to be this, this hidden thing, this mythical thing. But that's how we do it. It is through these conversations, and it starts though with building relationships, and starts with those conversations.
When you're looking at that side of it and developing the relationships, the obvious way in football is to have the position coaches work with their certain players. Now, I realize in high school, you might have a coach who's coaching basketball or wrestling or, having to do something else then. What are some of the different ways, I guess, best practices you've seen that just go beyond we're going to work with our position guys, some other ways that guys attack that, especially if during the off season their staff gets limited in numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do a lot of the times, and so we develop, I mentioned earlier, a leadership council, and we like to have a leadership council with a 1-4, 1-5 ratio for all the players. So if you have 50 players on your roster, you would have 10 people potentially on that leadership council. And the reason for that is those 10 people would be broken into units, okay? And so you might have, so there's 10 leaders, there's the 4 individuals that they're leading. And so now you can take, whether you've got 5 coaches on staff or you got 10 coaches on staff, you can start to actually delegate to the units. Well, you're in charge of Johnny and Billy's unit over here, okay? If you got like 5 coaches. And so now that coach is working, and they're looking after 10 people throughout the year, and it's not so much around position. And also they've got other players, these leaders that they're having to help check in and build relationships with these players too. And what I love about this, especially with American football teams, sorry, I'm used to saying American football because I've worked with so many European programs, and you got to get the difference between football.
We call it soccer.
Soccer, there you go, yeah. But the big thing I love here is that so often it can be very well, there's the offense, there's the defense, or there's these positions. So this helps to really connect the team beyond those position groups. It helps the other coaches to have time to relate and connect with those players. And what we see is if there are things that a position coach is spending so much time with that athlete. And so this gives another coach in their ear that maybe they don't get as much, that can reinforce some of the things that a position coach wants that athlete to work on, stuff like that. So we really use the units as a way to kind of shake the team up and give various coaches different roles to look after other groups of people, and use the captains or the leaders to also support that. And the beautiful thing here is, we've got coaches that do these one-on-ones, and they can do them once a month with all players on their team because they're able to delegate to other coaches, but also get creative. They spend time, they do these on the bus trips. They do these, sometimes after practices, in the mornings, during lunches, they really mix these one-on-ones up. But it is one of the most impactful things that we've seen coaches do, and well worth the investment.
Yeah, there's certainly the formal way of doing it, and yes, that takes time, but there's also looking for those opportunities and, just having a list, being able to check off that, okay, these are the 5 or 10 guys I'm responsible for who are in my unit for the off season, and you know what, I see this kid he's in the study hall that I'm a monitor of, or I see this kid at the lunch period, or this kid comes by before school sometimes. You have that opportunity to engage with those guys. It might be a little bit more informal, but sometimes that's even more impactful than sitting down in what feels like a formal meeting.
The trick here with this is formal or informal. And we don't want it to feel we never want it to be this thing where the player comes in and has to sit across the desk from you. But so we don't want it to be that level of formality. But we do want, there's check-ins, there's connecting, there's hey, come over here, let's just check, how you doing, that stuff. There's also sitting down and saying, hey, for this next 10 minutes, I'm all about you, and I'm asking questions, very intentional questions, which I really unpack in the book, to what's called a style of questioning that's called motivational interviewing, where instead of me telling you what you need to do differently, or me just, which is a fixing style, and instead of me following, which is just like, hey man, how's it going? Just checking in on you. Like, I'm just like, we'll take this conversation wherever you want it to go. We're taking a guiding style. So we are guiding them to think about what's important, what are their obstacles, and what can they do to kind of overcome those obstacles. So for us as coaches, though, like, we really have seen that when coaches know, oh, hey, coach is doing another round of one-on-ones, and we send out a Google form to get players to reflect on some of the questions that we want to talk about. What we do there is, going into the one-on-one, now the players have had to reflect on 3, 4, 5 questions. So they're already primed and ready to have a really effective conversation where they take ownership of their development. And that's a huge piece. That's a huge piece. We want them to really be in the driver's seat, and we're in the passenger seat when it comes to their own development, their own engagement. And this is what the Chicago Cubs learned about years ago when they started doing this. I think the Indians were doing it before them. I talk about the Cubs because they were the one that won the World Series. But at the end of the day, they really started to invest in these player development plans. And the idea was to really put the player in the driver's seat for their development.
We talked about developing the relationship. Now we're getting more into that engagement and the buy-in. We talked, more about the individual setting here, but now buying into the whole team concept and things that the team is working on together. How do you take that to the next step of developing that engagement and buy-in?
Yeah, when it comes to the team as a whole, one of the big things that we really encourage is that, every coach have a few non-negotiables, right? A few standards that come from them that are really clear. What I've seen is that great leaders across all organizations have their non-negotiables. So, for instance, the great John Wooden basketball coach had, be neat and clean, no profanity, never criticize a teammate, and be on time. You've got, got the Mike Abrashoff. His was never do anything that, endangers another life or cost taxpayers money. Pete Carroll has very similar to Wooden, no whining, no complaining, compete, and, be early, right? So all these great leaders, I've gotten to spend time with the Phoenix Suns, and Monty Williams, he's got his 3 that are posted right above his desk. They don't have a lot of standards. They don't have a lot of rules. They typically have 2, 3, or 4, and they're often very similar. So that's a starting point. But then to start to get the buy-in, it's about asking the players, hey, what does success look like for us? Not just a goal as far as, well, we want to win the state championship, or we want to win conference title, or we want to win the national championship. It's, what is success? Okay, maybe there is a goal, but it's also, if we all come together, what could we achieve together, and what would that experience be like? And so you kind of set this North Star, this direction you want to go, and they say, okay, if that's the experience that we want, and if that's who we want to become, what do we need to do day in and day out? And what are some of the obstacles that we're going to face? And how can we build some standards? So you really empower them to set some team standards around that. And then throughout the year, you keep coming back to that. You keep, you pull up different areas of your program. You say, guys, is this how we want to do things here? Is this going to lead us to the goals and the experience that we want? And you get clarity on different aspects of your program. You're just constantly getting them to reflect and take ownership. And we call that the standard review. Sometimes it's a weekly activity for coaches where they just pick an area of their program, or maybe something's slipping, right? Maybe it's the first game of the year. Maybe it's the first away game. Maybe, whatever. There's just some aspect of the program where we really want to be, you could use the word elite, at elite level, or we want to be excellent. And you just get the players to define what that excellence looks like and what it doesn't look like.
Looking at, you mentioned before, the player development plan, and you look at the best teams today are really taking an approach that it's not just the physical development, that they're developing the whole player. So in the culture system, what does the player development plan look like?
So coming back to that, I think it varies, but at the core, at the very top, first off, we like it to be a one-pager. And we really encourage our coaches to use digital. And most all the coaches I work with, theirs is a Google Doc that is then linked into a spreadsheet. So it's very easily pulled up, but the Google Doc is actually shared with the player. And sometimes, in some situations, the coach likes to share with the parent. So the parent sees, oh, hey, every time they meet, they send that to the parent and the player and just say, hey, like even a nice message to the parent. Hey, thanks for allowing me to coach your son. Just had a great meeting with him. We love what he's doing here and there. We talked about these things here. But on this one pager, you would have the goals or aspirations, like what's important to that individual. And sometimes those things would be very sport related. Other times they could be academic, and other times they could be life related. Underneath that, you have your areas of growth. Now you could have 6, 7 areas. You could have physical, technical skills, tactical ability. You could have character stuff. You could have cultural areas of growth, like how they're impacting a team or how they're leading, behavioral type things. But we really like to say never go more than 3 at a time. 3 or 4 things that you're really areas of growth, because you can't get better at everything. So maybe you might have a physical, and you might have some technical skills that an individual needs to be working on, and then maybe some personal habits or disciplines around sleep or something. And so you have the goal or the area of growth, which is followed by what we call the implementation intention. And James Clear talks about that in Atomic Habits. It's a big idea of essentially, when will you do something? How will you do it? Where will you do it? And how often are you going to do it? So helping to coach athletes to get really specific, not like, okay, well, I got to get better shape, so I need to run more. No, it's like, I'm going to do some extra fitness, before or after practice, in the mornings at this time, So the first is the goals or aspirations. The next is the areas of growth, followed by their commitments, which are very specific implementation intentions. We like to get really specific in those and coach those individuals on that. And then after that is the support plan. Is, okay, these are your commitments. How as a coach, can I support you in those things? And what that looks like, it could be, I'm going to check in with you every week on this. It could be, I can send you stuff. I might send you YouTube videos on things to work out with, or hey, I'll help you with your nutrition log, whatever it is, right? So it's those type of things, followed by, we like to encourage role, whatever the team is, are they first string? Are they second string? Are they third string? Just being really clear about where we see them right at that moment based upon, their performance. Getting that clarity is really, really important, because oftentimes players are confused about what their role is.
You mentioned earlier that there will be slip-ups. Nobody's perfect. The guys within your program will make mistakes. So that comes to the idea of discipline. And in teams you study, in what you've put together here, what are some of the best practices in terms of dealing with discipline?
The way that I did it for a long time was a fear-based approach, and I'm a big believer in we needed accountability. And for the longest time, if players didn't work hard, I'd make them run, I'd yell at them, I'd get on them, I'd scream, I'd do all the traditional ways of doing that. And you can do that. And if your players know that you love them, they will often accept that. And for many years, that worked for me, because my players knew that I loved them. However, even in the years that it was effective in the short term, it never achieved what I really wanted for the athlete long term. And what I mean for that is, they're working hard because I'm getting on them and they appreciate, yeah, coach cares about me, right? But I want to develop athletes that work hard, have a great attitude, and do the right things, because that's who they want to be. That's the person they are. And I want them, when I'm not there, when I'm not watching, or when they go on the next level, that they can work hard and have a great attitude and do all the right things without me there, without someone yelling at them, because that's reality, that's life. How many of us are adults in the workplace and, are people able to having to get on us about us and yell at us? Like, that's just not the current workplace. So you got to look at the long-term goals of discipline. The long-term goals of discipline is not just to get the player to do what you want them to do, which is work hard or have a good attitude. It's to build character. It's to nurture and maintain that relationship. Those are the types of things that we want. And it's to also drive intrinsic motivation. And so we can use fear-based tactics, right? But then essentially that will run out in the long term. So the long-term approach is definitely not permissiveness. I'll tell you that, right? And there's way too much permissiveness. There's too much there's a lot of empathy without accountability these days.
Mm-hmm.
And empathy without accountability is just a short-sighted attempt to relieve suffering. I feel bad for this kid. I'm making excuses for this kid. And so I'm not going to hold him accountable. No, you have to hold him accountable. So what does that look like? And the basic thing is to move away from punishments. Punishments is I do to you. I'm doing this to the athlete, right? You don't work hard? Well, I'm going to yell at you. You don't work hard? I'm going to make you run. A consequence is the approach, is the alternative to punishment. And a consequence is usually agreed upon beforehand. Hey guys, this is what's going to happen. If you choose to not work hard, or you choose to talk back to a coach, or you choose to yell at a referee, or you choose to do one of these things here, you choose to be late. Well, the consequence is this. And we like to move away from physical conditioning or that type of punitive stuff because, well, we want athletes to see conditioning as like something that's good for them, right? Secondly, we really want to embrace this mindset of practice is a get to, not a got to, right? Like you might have heard that before. Hey, it's a get to, not a got to. Well, we can reinforce that through what is called a logical consequence. And logical consequences are three main types. One of them is fix it, which is, hey, just do it again. You didn't work hard. Just do it again, man. The other one is a loss of privilege, right? And so we talk a lot about, hey, a player's not working hard in a drill. It's like, hey, man, step off. We'll see you in the next drill. You lost the opportunity to get better in this drill. And also we're retraining them. Other guys are going to get more reps at this. This guy just lost that opportunity. And we can do that in a way that's firm and it's demanding without it being demeaning. And when we do this, we reinforce practices that get to, the games that got to. It's not a privilege. We like to complain about entitlement. We can fight that with the way that we discipline. And it helps to tap into that intrinsic motivation for the athlete when we use these logical consequences. And I like to encourage coaches to find ways to do that in a progressive way. So before the kid loses the opportunity to practice, it's having him redo a drill or reset in a drill, right? Maybe he's redone it a couple times. All right, now just step off. As soon as you're ready to start working hard and have a good attitude, you let us know and we'll get you back in these drills. And so that's one of the core approaches or core tools is progressive logical consequences.
In looking at tools that are a part of this, and you have a lot of tools that you've built into this system, competitiveness, building the competitiveness in a team. Some teams, especially if they're young or if you're taking over a program that hasn't had success, you need to teach the guys to compete, and that can be a year-round thing. That can be in practice weekly. Some of my favorite practices, I go to spring balls, have a ton of competitiveness built in. I think of an Ohio State practice I went to, just sticks out in my mind how competitive those are. I mean, you have Mickey Marotti, calling out winners and losers on the PA system on the mic, right? Like those guys are competing every single rep, and you see them buying into it, getting better. Everybody's looking to do their best, right? There's no relaxing there. Those players are really getting after it. It's something you can do in the off season, something you can do in all kinds of different ways. But talk to us about some of those competitiveness tools that you've built.
Yeah, I know you've had Sean Miska on your podcast. I've had him on there, and he has some unique ways of training. It's really interesting to learn about the competitive cauldron over the years through what Dean Smith initially used at North Carolina when it came to basketball, which was then adopted by Anson Dorrance, who's won 21 national championships in soccer, followed by Pete Carroll adopted that from Dorrance, and he runs a competitive cauldron at the Seattle Seahawks. And the idea behind the competitive cauldron, and every coach has different ways of training and the drills they use and stuff, but it is to find a way to make almost every drill competitive in some way, shape, or form. And for years, I was like the loser's run, right? If you don't win, you're getting the line, you run. And honestly, I felt like that ate away from practice time. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it's kind of like I always wanted conditioning to be competitive, honestly. So we started flipping that. We started making conditioning competitive, and if you win, you scored points for the competitive cauldron. And we stopped doing running within practice. And so what we've developed with some of the coaches that we do, and we got a course on how to implement this all, but the cauldron it's a spreadsheet that then is fed. Yeah, it creates rankings, and you can have separate tabs for different positions and stuff like that. but you essentially want to put out there and make everything competitive in practice and then have a ranking. Now, some teams want to publicly post those rankings. Other teams choose to share those more privately. But the idea is everything's competitive at a certain point. Now, there might be what we call learning zone, and then we might be in a compete zone. So you might be teaching a new concept. You're not going to compete in that segment. But once you want guys going full game speed through something, you make it competitive. And what you end up finding is this comes back to feeding that intrinsic motivation, right? Rather than guys just going hard just because you're telling them to go hard. They're going hard because they like to win. And that's the thing I love about when you're coaching guys. I mean, we're all so naturally competitive. Even if you're not posting it, they just love the idea that coaches keeping track, you know?
I will put a link to some of those resources in the show notes as well. Coach mentioned a course there. Coach, as we wrap things up, wanted to dig into a little bit of, you mentioned the Buffalo Bills, obviously. A lot of people interested in what they're doing right now. They've been doing a great job. And you also said you spent some time with the Patriots. So I would love to hear just some examples of, how those teams really excel with a system of culture.
Yeah, I started the Patriots because I probably got more experience with them early on in my work, and got to go out there and spend some time at their training camp in 2018 and observe how they do things. And one of the things I thought was interesting was they practice how to practice. They practice how to run a halftime. And just a level of intentionality. They don't just expect individuals to know what to do or how to do it. I love the level of detail, and I've gotten to spend and know individuals that have spent a lot of time in that organization, and I think that just shows like the level of intentionality of setting the standards and the culture of the program. When it comes to the Bills, and the big thing that I love Sean McDermott and what he's doing out there. I think what early on is how he laid the foundation culturally. And they've had a couple tough breaks. I think they could have been in the Super Bowl here or there a couple times. But, what they did foundationally as a culture was they implemented a leadership council in the first few weeks of kind of getting off the ground. And I think that is, was one of their foundational things as they hit some turbulence early on and they were making some big roster changes was the leadership council McDermott would meet with, and he'd really get to share what was going on and have them be a part of the decision-making process and certain things. And when you bring your leadership council in on, why you're making certain decisions, but also they're a part of making certain decisions, then they can go out into the locker room and they can help to maybe quiet different rumors or solve different issues before they become bigger. And I think that is one of the most exceptional things that he's done, as well as it was in that first year, he really focused on building connections within players. And they used to, once a week, they would bring a player in or two, say, hey, you're going to talk to the team. They didn't bring in any guest speakers. I don't think he brought in like the John Gordons or any of those guys. He just brought in his own players and said, tell us about someone that was really important in your life and that has helped you to be where you are here today. And so guys would, have 2 or 3 photos they put up. They talk about their dad or their grandfather or their mother. And oftentimes there'd be, a room full of men crying, and I think it was called like the crying hour at one stage. But it was something that really bonded them. And so I thought those were 2 really impressive things. And I remember hearing those things years ago, and I'm not surprised that they're continuing to do well because he's got the culture right, and that's where it starts.
Well, you've transitioned from coaching the game to coaching coaches. And, the coaches I have on this podcast always finish with the same question. And so yours is tailored to the coaches. So when you look at everything you do, you mentioned some great things here today, great tools, the system, etc. But when you look at all the things you do to coach the coaches, what's the one thing you think really gives them the winning edge?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it is not just practical tools, though I think people are that is what just drawn people to working with me. I've been able to, help coaches get very practical and beyond the principles of what we want it to look like. the leadership principles and all that, but take it and put it down to a very granular level. But it is the coaching on those tools and skills is the greatest thing. And at the core of my coaching is these weekly conversations where a coach and I sit back and we reflect, what's happened the previous week. We reflect on certain conversations, we reflect on certain players, and then we also look to the week ahead and we say, okay, how can you be intentional and be more intentional than you've been in the past? How can you apply some of these skills or tools or make sure we're on track? And so I think having someone in a coach's corner that's helping them to apply these tools within their context, but also is that sounding board that is not tied emotionally to the situation, that can be a truth teller when a coach starts to lose their way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a game changer. And it was a game changer for me as a coach. That's what I needed to honestly save myself from rock bottom.
Well, a lot of great resources. I mentioned we would share those. So I know what really piqued my interest in getting you on the show was a course on CoachTube. I'll put that one in the show notes. Tell our listeners where else they can find your resources.
Yeah, I mean, you can find the book. It's on audiobook, Audible, also hardback, paperback, the whole stuff at Amazon. It's called The Culture System, a proven process for creating an extraordinary team culture. Also, my website, tocculture.com. tocculture.com it's got a competitive culture course on it. It's got the playing time system course on it, as well as we're launching next month the Culture System online course. And then if you want to follow me on social media, I occasionally post stuff on Twitter at JP Nerbun, which is JPNERBUN.
Well, Coach, I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing with us today, and certainly would love to catch up and maybe dive into some other tools that you have for coaches in the future.
Yeah, I'd love the opportunity because it's great to share with football coaches. Honestly, great to get guys more and more intentional about this really important aspect of them not just being successful on the scoreboard, but successful in the way that they're impacting the young men that they get to coach.